Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. The Senate President Ahmad Lawan on Monday gave the clearest indication yet that the Senate would pass a $29.96 billion loan request by President Muhammadu Buhari. Mr. Lawan, while addressing journalists in Abuja, said the Senate would approve the loan request but would ensure adequate oversight. President Buhari had on November 28th forwarded a request to the Senate to reconsider and approve the federal government's 2016 to 2018 external borrowing plan. The loan, he said, is to execute key infrastructural projects across the country. The president had sent the same request to the 8th Senate under Bukola Saraki in 2016. He had requested for about $30 billion, and then the lawmakers, however, rejected the request as the majority voted against it when it was brought for consideration. While joining us now to discuss this, amongst other economic-related matters in Nigeria, is Johnson Chukwu, Chief Executive Officer of Cowry Asset Management Limited. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning.
Good morning. Good to have you again on the morning show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Well, we'll get to the loan request.
Okay, Merry Christmas to all of us.
Yes.
Merry Christmas to you, too.
We'll get to the loan request shortly, but let's start with something important that happened yesterday. The president was 77, and he used the occasion of his 77th birthday to sign the Appropriation Bill 2020 into law. Now, since 2016, this will be the first time that we will not have any altercation, disagreement between the executive and the legislature. But what's your assessment of the fact that we will now return to a January-December budget cycle, and what has happened between the executive and the legislature over the approval of the 2020 budget, and how is the market reacting? By market, I mean the business community.
Yeah, I understand. Well, in the first place, for me as a person, it's actually a cheering news that we are reverting to a fiscal year that is at consonance with the calendar year. So we're going to have, for the first time in a long while, the budget will be implemented from January to December. There's actually a provision that was inserted in the budget by the National Assembly for the government to implement the budget from January to December. If you cast your mind back to our recent past, this year, the 2019 budget was signed into law on 27th of May, 2019. Almost 5 months gone. Last year, 2018 budget was signed into law on 20th of June, 2018. 6 months gone. And the unfortunate thing about signing the budget mid-year is that because of our seasonal conditions, you realize that if you sign a budget in May or June, you are signing a budget at the tick of the rainy season. Little or no fiscal infrastructure development take place at the tick of the rainy season. And what is left is that the last quarter of the year, which is October to December, is when you can implement effectively any of the components of the capital budget, particularly those that relate to fiscal infrastructure. So you realize that most of the budgets in the past years were not implemented for two reasons. One, they were signed into law late, and two, the revenues of the government are far below, the revenue projections are far below the actuals. So you realize that beyond the issue of delay in signing budget, you also have to deal with the challenges of the government not generating enough revenue to meet the budgetary requirements. But we're eliminating one of those challenges, which is the timing of the budget signing and implementation. So the next thing is how to deal with the revenue shortfall that you have to contend with, so as to ensure that you have the capacity to implement the budget.
Yeah, but what are the challenges that you foresee? Because even the president himself, in signing that budget, describes it as a deficit budget. About 24% of that total will go into debt servicing.
Debt repayment, $1.12 billion.
The current is still higher than, capital. Although the Senate president had said, well, with the passing of the deep offshore and inland basin production sharing contract amendment bill, and also the passing of the finance bill, that there will be greater outcries to the federal government to be able to fund the budget properly. But what are the key challenges that you think, remain that we can run into, either in terms of the benchmarks or in terms of the reality of our financial ecosystem?
I think I'll start from the reality of the financial ecosystem or the financial structure of the fiscal policy. If you look at the budget has made provision about 8.15 trillion naira of government revenue for 2020. the budget is projecting for government to spend about 10.594 trillion naira. But Cassio, let's just take a few steps backward and look at our performance as it relates to revenue generation. In 2018, total revenue accruable to the federal government was only 3.86 trillion naira. Total federal government expenditure was 7.5 trillion naira. Budgeted revenue for 2018 was 7.12 trillion naira. So in effect, you had budgeted about 7 trillion naira, you only generated 3.86 trillion naira. This year, at the end of the first half of this year, by the end of June, total government revenue was only 2.04 trillion naira. You had a budget of about 7 trillion naira for the full year. Now, just oppose that to the projected revenue about 8.15 trillion naira. So you realize that the greatest challenge that the budget will face is ability to generate enough revenue to meet the budgetary provisions. And if you do not generate the revenues, you are bound to fail to execute the budget.
Exactly.
Which is what has happened consistently over the past couple of years. So if you ask me, one greatest challenge we have is as it relates to the ability of the government to generate the revenue to meet budgetary provisions.
But to buttress Doctor's point, what does that do for the debt portfolio in terms of the economy stakeholders? Does it scare off investors? How does this work?
You mean how it will relate to the investors?
Yes, indeed.
You see, for the investors, they are looking at some of those factors that are keeping the economy from being competitive. Is the government addressing them? One of which is infrastructure, with the infrastructural deficit. The next one is policy environment. And then the third one will be in terms of specific incentives that are designed to incentivize investors to invest in certain sectors of the economy. If you start from infrastructural deficit, given the current budget of about 2.4 trillion naira made provision for capital expenditure, is it possible we can implement that if you have a severe revenue shortfall? Last year, 2018, what you realize that the government borrowed about 2.64 trillion naira. And the government's capital expenditure was only 1.7 trillion naira, which means about 1 trillion naira was borrowed to fund recurrent expenditure and debt service. So, similarly, if you look at the current budget, look at recurrent expenditure, we have a provision of 4.84 trillion naira in recurrent expenditure. We have a budgetary provision of about 2.7 trillion naira, 2.73 trillion naira for debt service. So if you add those two, you already have more than 7 trillion naira. Remember last year, your total revenue was 3.86 trillion naira. So even if you grow the revenue, according to what Ruben said, they've passed the finance bill. If you look at the finance bill, what are those income heads that could immediately be converted into revenue? Probably the value-added tax.
Maybe not, because the federal government's share of value-added tax is really very small.
15%. Let me tell you, last year, 2018, the federal government VAT receipt was only 147 billion. So even if you mark it up by 50%, you will still be at about 200 billion, which will not make a material impact in terms of revenue shortfall of the federal government.
Okay, so let me come in here with the $29.96 billion loan that has now been approved as requested. As we know, this was rejected in 2016 by the Saraki-led Senate, and it's now been approved. And what is interesting is we never bring up the conversation of the interest rates or the tenures that are put on these loans, because a lot of loans have 30-year tenures, which means that at the end of the day, it's my generation that's going to be stuck paying back these loans.
Then my generation would have died.
We're not given a seat at the table.
Baby boomers would be gone.
Exactly, but we're not given a seat at the table when it comes to discussing these issues. So what exactly does this do for young people like me when we have to look at figures of $30 billion and we're not discussing the tenure of this loan? Is it that we're going to be stuck paying this back?
But take along with what she's asking you, what the debt management officer said about what they call the debt management strategy, which is to take low interest, long-term
foreign currency debt,
high costs,
But I mean, it's still the same thing Layla's saying.
Local, loans. Look at that, yes.
Let me put it in a proper perspective. And these are some of the questions, if I were in a position to ask the government, I would have first asked them. why do you have to present a 2016 to 2018 borrowing plan in 2020? Because this is the 2020 you're presenting it. Why do I ask that question? Your financial condition has materially changed between 2016 and 2018 and 2019. I'll give you some highlights of where we were in terms of debt in 2016. At the end of 2015, our total national debt was only 12.6 trillion naira. It was only 18% of our GDP. Our debt service, as at that time, was only 35% of federal government revenue. Mark those words. By the end of 2018, our entire national debt had grown to 25.7 trillion naira from 12.6 trillion naira, a growth of 13.1 trillion naira. Our foreign currency debt had grown from $10.72 billion to $25.1 billion, a growth of about $16.4 billion.
Wow.
It's terrible.
So if you wanted to borrow 30 billion in 2016, and you have invariably borrowed about $16.4 billion between that time and now, do you still need to borrow the same $30 billion? Today, our debt service to revenue is 58%. When you sought for that borrowing, it was only 35%. Your debt to GDP was only 18% when you sought to borrow 30 billion. It is now 33%.
No, that's not the figure we are given.
I can tell
I don't know where you are getting your statistics from.
Because what is our GDP? Our GDP today is 69 trillion naira at the end of last year. Total debt as at the end of last year was 25.1 trillion naira. Do the figures, do the maths.
It's just under half.
Well, I'm checking, but please continue.
Then debt service. Last year, our debt service was 2.24 trillion naira. Federal government revenue was 3.86 trillion naira. Do the figures. If
Under the leadership of Buhari, Nigeria's total debt stock rose to 25.7 trillion naira
you are saying that
in
they are
June
lying to us.
2019.
You are the one saying that.
No.
But I'm putting figures that are actual figures.
These are correct figures.
No, because your figures are different from the ones from the Debt Management Office. So are you saying that the DMO is lying to Nigerians? Statistics.
Who am I to say that? But what I'm saying that these are facts. And I'm quoting facts. So let whoever has the contrary figure should put it forward. And let's compare with the statistics from the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics.
I mean, I have a figure of 25.7 up until June 2019. So if we're up to December,
back to your,
it's much larger.
Back to your question.
No, I'll get the figures for you.
But Layla, let's answer Layla's question because she did ask with regards to the debt management.
So back to your question. The issues are, does Nigeria need to continue to borrow as a strategy to fund infrastructure? Like I mentioned earlier, last year we borrowed about 2.6 trillion naira. Only 1.7 trillion of that went into infrastructure. 1 trillion went into meeting the recurrent expenditure of the government.
We're borrowing for infrastructure, but we're renovating our National Assembly.
Okay. Now I'm back to the issues, which is what I have said, I've canvassed at your program. Why don't we review our strategy for funding infrastructure? It is clear to us that the kind of infrastructure gap we have today in the country will not be funded from budgetary allocations. So what is stopping us from evolving a financing arrangement where we bring in private capital to fund infrastructure? It doesn't take away the benefit of that infrastructure being in our local environment.
We'll need to go on a short break. When we return, we'll be interested in this strategy for funding infrastructure beyond taking external loans. We'll be right back. We still have here Johnson Chukwu, Chief Executive Officer, Cowry Asset Management Limited. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the morning show here on Horizon News. Mr. Johnson Chukwu, CEO of Cowry Assets Management Limited, is still here with us looking into the 2020 budget. And I had asked you about the pains of my generation when we are met with paying back this $30 billion loan that was approved for infrastructure.
Interest by that time.
Exactly,
so much more.
With interest as well and the lot. And sir, you were making your point.
Okay, your colleague has actually harassed me. that I and are not taking cognizance of your
Boys
generation.
club, the old boys club.
Yes.
Okay, the basic thing is that, probably I should put it in this way, there's certainly nothing wrong with borrowing. If we're borrowing for your generation, and we're borrowing to invest in infrastructure, that will catalyze growth of the economy and expand the size of the economy, you will get the benefits of those borrowing, which is basically what's happening in other countries, or what happened in other countries. Generations build for triple generations ahead of them. And basically what is lacking is that if the entire borrowing is going to specific infrastructure, if it was ring-fenced, and we say, look, we're borrowing $10 billion, we're building standard gauge rail from Lagos to Ibadan, to Kano or to Sokoto, and we're taking another $7 billion, and we're building another standard gauge rail from Lagos to Calabar. You know what will happen? If you open up that corridor, industries will spring up along that corridor. They will employ people of your generation. Those people will earn income, and they will create an environment that you want to enjoy.
In reality.
Yes. And the reality is that what would have happened is that because you are going to see an increase in productive activities, your income, per capita income will increase because the GDP of the country will increase. You will enjoy more life than we did. But the problem will be, if we are borrowing for consumption, to satisfy our own mundane interests or fancies, what will happen is we are going to heap a debt that there is no underlying asset from which you will generate revenue to pay back. And that is where we're saying we really cannot continue to borrow the way we're borrowing, because we're not really borrowing in a ring-fence, in a structured manner that all the monies are going into specific infrastructure that are catalyzing economic growth and expansion. In other countries, if we do that, you won't have a problem. But if we borrow on your behalf for the debt you will pay, and we use it to fly private jets, drink the best champagne, and enjoy a good life, or renovate our offices, like you pointed out, then that's where the problem will come from. Because next thing you have to renovate those offices again. And reality is that there is no increase in productive activity, there's no increase in economic capacity, and there won't be increase in earnings and opportunities for the young people.
No, but hasn't the federal government addressed that? Because you know that when this external borrowing proposal was presented to the 8th Assembly, the reason it was rejected was that it was not clear.
It wasn't detailed enough.
What the federal government wanted to do with the proposed $29.96 billion that they wanted to borrow. Now, this Senate President, Ahmad Lawan, when the proposal was first put before the Senate, he opposed it in October. He said, no, we can't keep borrowing. He didn't. But later, the federal government provided a detailed borrowing plan, and he did a 360 degrees. Yeah. And he said that now it's very specific. They want to spend this money on infrastructure, not to buy private jets, as you pointed out. And that the responsibility of the National Assembly in passing it, in accepting the request, will be to monitor and make sure that the loan is used for what is required. But you were talking about a strategy for funding infrastructure, something different. What are you thinking about? Sukuk bond or private capital? And if it's private capital, where is that private capital going to come from? Okay,
let's start from the allusions you made on the purpose of the borrowing. Can you remind us of the expenses or the projects that are to be spent on from the borrowing?
Rail is included, which is an area in which this administration has been making an effort. Another infrastructure. You know that we have a huge infrastructure.
I hear things like power.
Yes, power is there.
Okay, now, let's look at power, for instance. There are 3 segments of the power equation. You have the generation, you have the distribution, and you have the transmission. The generation and distribution are both in the private hands, correct? The only element that is in public hand is the transmission. How many times have we had system collapse?
10 times this year.
Too many.
The national grid has collapsed this year 10 times.
Is there any of the distribution grids, the distribution network, that have collapsed since they were handed over? In as much as they are inefficient, they've not achieved the objective of the privatization plan. Is there any single generation network, distribution network that has collapsed? So if we are having consistent collapse of the national grid, transmission grid, does it tell us that it's high time we hand it over to the private sector instead of pumping more money into it to say you are borrowing to pump into an infrastructure you are not able to manage efficiently? That's the question number 1. Now, I hear things like they've been flying the kite about reactivating or doing turnaround maintenance of the refineries. In my lifetime, how many times have we done the turnaround and maintenance of the refineries? What have we produced for the refineries? That's the next question. Third question, you mentioned the issue of rail infrastructure. Yeah, all of you have traveled around the world. If you go to Europe, what is...
I'm too sure.
I don't know you have to say something.
Believe me, at least I once saw you in New York with President Jonathan. Will you deny that? So, you know the speed of modern rail lines. Like I said, what do you need to build a rail network? We have a rail network plan. What amount do you need to build a rail network? The Lagos-Kano standard gauge rail, about 1,300 kilometers of standard gauge rail, Obasanjo gave the contract about $8.3 billion. That's one corridor. So if you want to borrow 30 billion, you are not going to do 3 corridors in the country. So you will not achieve material effect as much as you will if you advertise those corridors because they are commercially viable and ask private capital to bid for it. And they will bid and build those things. You tax the profit they will make. They will create employment. The infrastructure will remain in the country. And then you will use that resource that you would have committed to build schools, build hospitals, develop the human capital, improve the quality of the curriculum, and then build the intellectual capacity that will begin to compete with the best in the world.
Sounds like sustainable development.
In a nutshell.
Well, let's vary this. We've been talking about budget, loan, and all that. Yesterday, we had the spokesperson of NATI on this program. And we were discussing the beneficial ownership register. You know, a portal has been created by NATI to just put out there, you know, a program for ownership transparency of, you know, mines in, you know, in Nigeria and also oil blocks, ownership structure in the oil and gas sector. How important do you think that is to address the issues of opaqueness and lack of accountability in the extractive industry in Nigeria?
When I read it, I was excited. I immediately tried to log in to see those who own the assets. You know? But unfortunately, I couldn't get access the owners of those assets. Probably they have not populated it or they had not gone live. Because the first thing
they've gone live. They are, you know, building it up to make it more comprehensive.
I tried to assess it. But the basic thing is this, that transparency is important. But not just the transparency in terms of ownership. Transparency in terms of the process of allocating those assets or auctioning those assets is also very critical. The main opaqueness we're witnessing is not necessarily in the terms of ownership, it's how the assets are transferred from government to private individuals. I do not think those transfers have actually been subjected to the best of transparency standards globally. So if you sell an asset to my son, who is a minor, and then you publish his name, I can tell you 1,000,001 people will not know who is Chibuikem Johnson Chukwu. You understand what I'm saying? So if you see a Chibuikem Johnson Chukwu in the registrar as the owner of a major oil well, what difference does it make? The question is that, was it open to everybody to bid for it? Was it publicly advertised? Were people given enough time? Were the conditions specified that you must meet to qualify to bid for those assets? So that is what is lacking. It's not just the registry. The registry is good, we have it. I mean, there's always, any form of openness is appreciated or is positive. But we must have a very transparent process that will lead to transfer of whatever is a public asset to individual hands. And that, for me, is the appropriate thing we should be driving at.
Absolutely, because what I was also going to say is that what's so good about this register is that there's so many individuals and companies with assets out there that are not even maximizing the potential of these assets. And one would ask, does that person even deserve to have this asset in their hands? But would you say that a register like this now puts pressure on leases of these assets to actually start maximizing the potential of these assets and doing the right thing? But I say this because are we so sure that there are not also going to be people, and especially politically affiliated people, connected to assets that have fronts that are put up for them, and therefore we won't ever know?
Well, there's a shell company.
Which is why the Panama Papers was such a huge deal. It's like yesterday I asked about the 2014 One report on the $1 trillion that is lost every year by developing countries to that front that is put up. How transparent is this process going to be, and how much assurance is it going to give us that going to maximize the potential of these assets?
You know, I don't You know, ideally, if you define the pre-qualification criteria, you also have to define post-qualification criteria, which means you must meet these certain conditions to even qualify to bid for these assets. Then after winning the assets, you must have minimum performance standards, which we must abide with. If you fail to abide with those minimum standards, there should be a recourse. Either the government, you can forfeit that asset, or you will be compelled to admit new shareholders in those assets. The key thing is that if those conditions are not defined, that be an issue. Whatever is not measured is never achieved. Yeah. If the standards are not defined, they have an issue. Then you don't expect anybody to comply with any unknown standard. If you define standard and say, look, for instance, let's talk of the marginal fuels, or even talk of the award of
oil blocks.
Before the oil blocks,
okay.
The government has given us several licenses for production of refining of petroleum products. What they call, you know, they have a scheme where you can have small refineries.
Modular
refineries. Thank you very much. And several licenses have been issued for modular refineries. None of them is operating apart from one. So what has happened to those licenses? Have they not expired in the hands of the holders? Can those people, if conditions change tomorrow, go and say they have a license? If you have failed to deploy the license you got from government, and there are no sanctions attached to it, there's a problem. You mentioned the issue of marginal fuels. Several of the marginal fuels awardees are not operating them.
All right, I think that might be a place for us to...
Why have they not reverted to the government? There must be specific conditions. Look, you have this marginal fuel, you have maybe 30 months or 36 months or 48 months to ensure you deploy the asset. If you fail to, it will revert to the government.
I think the basic thing we agree about is open governance, transparency and accountability.
Absolutely.
And
more public registers.
Yeah.
Sustainable